brought to you courtesy of the red, white, and blue.
And good afternoon, everyone. Coming at you, recorded from not-so-sunny scenic Lincourt, New York. Hey, remember when we used to have those March storms and you'd say, great, I got a snow day. Today, we just watch Marvel movies and do AP homework. Alexa, turn off. Yes, that's right, that was the Captain America theme song, not from World War II. It's actually from 1966.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Will you stop disrupting class? Alright, not from World War II, but actually from 1966, but we'll get to why Captain America is important later on. And Alexa's just got a mind of her own. Alexa, turn off. Alright, so today we are talking about the home front for World War II. Remember, AP doesn't really go into a ton of military history. Midway, turning point in the Pacific. D-Day, turning point for the European invasion. Pearl Harbor, it's a date which will live in infamy. Move on, okay? But what we really have to talk about is the impact of World War II on the United States at home. Not just on the people who fought the war, who sacrificed so much for us, but for the people who sacrificed in other ways, or whose lives were affected. Alright, so before we go any further, let's go to the big board. Couple things to remember here. First things first, Mr. Eschbacher's simple rules for passing the AP test. One of them, war brings change. I don't care what war we've spoken about this year. We always have to look at the results of the war. What changes came about for women, for workers, for Native Americans, for African Americans, for the economy, for social reforms, and for the power of our politicians. Remember that. War brings change.
Here's a reminder. Feed the dog.
Yes, we take care of our dog in our house. Alexa, turn off reminder. Alright. Second rule to remember. In a time of war, your civil liberties, they go bye-bye. Yes, cue up your Backstreet Boys song. When we have a war crisis, civil liberties get put on hold. Reference back to John Adams during the quasi-war with France, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Go to Abraham Lincoln suspending the writ of habeas corpus with the Copperheads during the Civil War. Remember, if I say Schenck versus the U.S., you say? That's right, clear and present danger, World War I. We'll see that again with World War II, particularly with Japanese Americans. We can also fast forward that to post 9/11 America with things like the USA Patriot Act. Alright, another big rule for war. In a time of war, the Prez gets more power. Why? Because he's the one who can make the quick decisions. He's the one who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He's the face that hopefully the American people turn to in a time of crisis. We'll see that again here in both good and bad ways. Last but not least, I feel like we should have a little Boys to Men montage because we have come to the end of the road for period 7. Yes, the end of World War II, 1945, brings about the end of period 7, and here in 2020, that will be our last new content for the AP test. Okay, so again, today we're talking about the impact of World War II on America at home, and let's go to our high-tech big board here as we march right along and see what this war did. Okay, so we're going to march right in, and we're going to be joined right now by our soldier because he insisted on being in this video, and I've got to teach him first grade, so I need some cooperation. This is how I get him to do his reading homework, by the way, it's you guys. Alright, so, a couple things here. First thing. When we talk about wars, there's no laissez-faire, guys. We are full-fledged, hands-on the economy. And World War II is the epitome of this, okay? For one thing, we're going to say see it to the New Deal. New Deal reforms and stuff like that effectively are going to kind of go by the wayside. We will see, though, some carryover from the New Deal. Remember, it's the New Deal that gives us the ability to make this wartime production. And I'll give you a funny story, too. One of the great accomplishments of the New Deal was the banning of child labor. Now, when World War II began, we were not prepared militarily for it enough. We needed bombers. We needed mass-produced bombers, particularly early in the war, what were called B-17 bombers. And who could you turn to in America to mass produce something? Good old Henry Ford. Henry Ford opened up the world's longest assembly line in Michigan, and he cranked out those B-17 bombers. They had so many bombers being built, they actually had beds for pilots to sleep on, and as soon as their plane was ready, they'd gas it up and you'd take off. There was a runway coming right off the factory. But the problem is, as you were producing these bombers, you had a lot of finite technical work. You had to get wiring done. You had to put navigational systems in. And you had really cramped spaces. Now think of what you learned throughout history. Who does the cramped space type of work? That's right, my little helper here. But the New Deal abolished child labor. So, what do? You're an American, you're Henry Ford. You get creative. Did you know during World War II, Henry Ford became the largest employer of midgets in the United States? Yes, that's true. Okay, now, we talk about the government getting hands-on. We have things like the War Production Board, the WP, oh wow, I couldn't afford the B, it turned into a D. Alright, the War Production Board. The government managed wartime industries. They set what would be produced in factories. They controlled raw materials. That War Production Board was then followed by what was called the Office of War Mobilization, the OWM, which set production priorities. It literally told companies, this has to get made. It controlled raw materials. Why do we care about that? Little bit of a connection to modern times. There's been a question as to whether or not President Trump will activate the Office of War Mobilization to tell corporations, look, you need to make masks for COVID-19 or you need to make ventilators. The government does, under that War Mobilization Act, have the authority to do that. The OPA, the Office of Price Administration, don't worry, I didn't screw that acronym up. Remember, that's War Production Bureau with a B. The OPA, it regulated prices. It froze wages. It had the power to freeze rents. It had the power to freeze the consumer goods like meat, sugar, and gasoline, because those would be in short supply and those could instantaneously jack up and cause all kinds of inflationary problems. We like to think today that we're so darn green. The truth is, my grandparents, your great-grandparents, actually, my grandparents, yeah, okay, they kicked our butts when it came to being green. We see America in a big recycling binge, a recycling movement during this time period. Scrap metal drives were very commonplace. People were encouraged to recycle anything they could. Why? Because that useless piece of metal could now become a weapon. Housewives in America got in on the recycling. One of the links you had was about how bacon turned into bombs. Or, as I like to say, if your mom's a bad cook, well, your mama's meatloaf might cause a problem in your stomach, but it could have killed Nazis.
You know what? I will have some meatloaf. Let's have some meatloaf. You want some? I need to. Hey, Mom! The meatloaf! We want it now!
Housewives in the United States would be encouraged to strain bacon grease, other meat drippings, save it up in something like a coffee can. Now understand, you didn't go to the Mega Wega. You didn't go to Costco back in the 1940s. If you needed meat, you went to the butcher. If you needed bread, you went to the baker. Housewives would collect and strain out this animal fat, which could congeal, nice nasty, grease, and that contains a lot of triglycerides, fat. You take that to the butcher would buy it off you. And then that would get sold to defense contractors because through a little bit of refining, those glycerides would be turned into glycerin, think nitroglycerin and other things that would go boom. In other words, yeah, your mama's meatloaf, it was a killer. Maybe over in Germany or Japan. Alright, rationing, daylight savings. Yes, we ration daylight. Remember, daylight savings, hey, let's connect a couple different time periods. Daylight savings was originally the idea of good old Ben Franklin. He made an observation you could save candle wax. During World War I, Congress enacted daylight savings. Why? Mess around with the daylight hours, you can conserve fuel. We brought it back again for World War II. It won't be until a couple decades later where it officially becomes a law. But, yeah, they were messing with your sleep during World War II, guys. Rationing. Fellas, ask your grandpa, your great-grandpa, if he remembers courting young ladies. My grandpa Eschbacher, or as you guys know him, Chief, taught me this story about how if you wanted to ask a pretty girl out on a date, you couldn't get her chocolates. Roses, Everyone's doing that. You couldn't get chocolates because they were in short supply. But if you could get her a pair of stockings, because remember back then girls were always wearing dresses and skirts. You couldn't get stockings, ladies. Stockings are made out of nylon or silk, which are both really important materials for making things like parachutes. So if all of a sudden you could get your hands on a pair like that, you had a good chance she'd say yes to at least one date. But there are other examples of rationing. You know, right now, oh my gosh, we're seeing a great connection. I survived Wegmans yesterday. I survived Price Chopper. I went to two different grocery stores to find toilet paper. Yeah, you were asleep. But think about it. Go in the grocery stores right now and you see signs everywhere. You know, limit 1 gallon of milk, limit 4 cans of soup, 1 package. Yeah, you. Stop hoarding. You don't need 100 of them. 1 package of toilet paper. During World War II, households were given ration coupon books. And when you did your shopping, you had to present that ration book. If you bought a gallon of milk, they would stamp your book. And your ration books were based upon the size of your family. So a family of my size, 5 people, would get so many gallons of milk, so many pounds of ground beef, so many pounds of flour. And if you didn't have your ration coupon book, the store clerks had to say, "We're sorry." Gasoline was rationed. Now back then, you didn't have self-serve. You'd drive in the gas station and say, "Hey, fill her up, buddy." And the guy would say, "I can see your ration coupon book." "Sir, you only got 5 gallons left here. I can't fill this thing up." Everything got rationed. There were massive shortages of basic consumer goods because, let's face it, if we have to have food, we're going to divert it to our soldiers. So the government had to do those price freezes with the Office of Price Administration. It also had some unintended consequences. Twinkies, guys. Twinkies. Hopefully my great special effects guy John will put a picture of Twinkies up right about now. So, Twinkies, you know, they can survive the nuclear holocaust, they never expire or something. They're featured in the first Die Hard movie. You know that white stuff on the inside of Twinkies that at another temperature would be a styrofoam surfboard? It wasn't always like that. Twinkies used to be filled with banana cream made from real bananas, and they were really good. Now, I wasn't around during World War II, but about 20-something years ago, the Hostess Company came back with what they called classic Twinkies, made from that banana cream. They were amazing. What happened? Well, fresh fruits and vegetables, like bananas, were hard to come by. And again, if you're going to get them, you send them to our soldiers. So the Hostess Company went to that stuff. Outside my classroom, we have that courtyard. If that was around during World War II, we might be planting a victory garden there. People were encouraged to plant victory gardens. Why? If you're growing your own fruits and vegetables, you're not buying them, which means they're not being taken away from our fighting men and women who are trying to protect us. Again, this idea of rationing. That'll be important because one of the results of World War II is, just like World War I, a huge boom in consumerism. Think about it. Great Depression, you couldn't buy stuff because you didn't have money, or you didn't have a job, or the factories were closed. World War II, you couldn't buy stuff because you couldn't get it, because the factories were producing military stuff. Now, after World War II, the first credit cards are going to get created. The Diners Club card. All right, we talked about price and wage freezes. The government's got to pay for this war, and there's only a couple ways they can do it. Yes, they can raise taxes, but let's be real. You can only tax so much. So what does the government do to pay for anything? They don't. They borrow money. And how do they borrow money during World War II? They sell war bonds. And war bonds become an important propaganda tool. If you're a wartime hero and you have an injury, you might be shipped home to do the circuit of, hey, you know, sell your war bonds. For you Marvel fans, remember Captain America, when he got the super serum, was put out there to like raise morale, do some propaganda.
Series E defense bonds. Each one you buy is a bullet in the barrel of your best guy's gun.
You'll see Bugs Bunny cartoons where all of a sudden he whips out this sign out of that rabbit suit. It never had pockets. Where was he hiding those signs? That would say, buy war bonds.
Get your savings out when you hear him shout, any bonds today. Come on and get 'em, folks. Come on, skip right up and get 'em.
Hollywood would get into it. The famous artist Norman Rockwell would do artwork about the 4 freedoms. Hollywood really played up this idea of, quote, the good war. You know, World War II was the best example of so black and white. It's good against evil, what we're fighting against. Toward the end of the war, we're going to see another big economic issue that relates directly to this gosh darn AP test that you're stressing about. In 1944, Congress did a bit of planning, and boy, it paid off. They passed what was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, more commonly known as the GI Bill of Rights. Okay, remember, GI means government issue. It's the slang term for our soldiers.
G.I. Joe! G.I. Joe is there!
Here's the problem. You are going to have 15 frickin' million Americans coming home after the war. There aren't enough jobs. They need help. So what happens? Sidetrack a bunch of them away from the job market so you don't have economic problems. Get them to go to college. The GI Bill would pay for their college. In fact, one of the reasons why the College Board, those AP, SAT folks, was created was because you had this huge glut, this onslaught of all these people applying for college, and they want to come up with some type of way to measure, you know, are you in fact ready for college? The GI Bill did more than just that, though. It created $16 billion in loans to start a business, to buy a home. Where I grew up in New Jersey, all the neighborhoods I used to deliver newspapers in were post-World War II houses. And on Fridays when I do the collections, you know, I talk to the old ladies. Of course, you got to schmooze and talk, so hopefully you get your $1 tip for the week. And they would tell the stories about how, you know, their husband bought this house, you know, in the late 40s, early 50s. My Grandpa Henry, he bought his house in Hillsdale, New Jersey in the 1950s. Housing was really cheap back then. It was like $58,000. Okay? The Manhattan Project. Now I know you'd say, Ash, this belongs in military. Hey, soldier, duck, enemy fire. All right. The Manhattan Project. I know you'd say, look, this belongs with military stuff, but understand, it wasn't just a bunch of army guys. The Manhattan Project became one of the biggest sources of employment. You had people working in the labs in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the nuclear bombs were tested. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, you were manufacturing uranium. You had plants throughout the country at top secret levels. Fun fact, the first nuclear reactor built in the United States was in Chicago, underneath the University of Chicago, underneath their football field. A simple reactor made out of carbon blocks in the middle of one of the biggest cities in the country. What could have gone wrong? Oh, I don't know. All right, maybe that's why the Cubs stunk for so long. All right, other economic issues. Unions and corporations during World War II. Duck! Unions and corporations during World War II. They reach an understanding. Again, it's this idea of patriotism. They agree not to go on strike. Now, that's going to hold up for the most part. But again, when all of a sudden workers who are busting their butts are told, your wages have been frozen, that's going to cause some ill will. For example, John L. Lewis will organize a couple different coal miners' strikes during World War II. But you see everyone trying to do their patriotic duty. Factories that were building Liberty ships, transport ships for the war effort, would have contests. How fast could you build one of these cargo and transport ships? Everybody got in the act of, if I'm not fighting, I'm working, I'm doing something to do their patriotic duty. Okay, moving on. Now we have to talk about one of our other key ideas. Civil rights during World War II. Think about it. We are fighting a war against racism, against hatred, against bigotry, but we still have to come to terms with our own ledger. We've got red in our ledger. Okay? During World War II, we see a lot of issues that would go under I for identity in our bagpipe chart. During the war itself, the United States established an agreement with the Mexican government to allow temporary workers in to work as farm workers. These people were called braceros. And what the braceros program did was, it brought agricultural workers in to make up for wartime labor shortages. Remember, you have a situation where you've got enough men fighting off in the war effort, and you need to be able to replace those workers. The braceros program is going to go until 1964 or so, and it sponsored 4.5 million people coming to the United States. Now, unfortunately, we've seen this throughout American history. When you get a big influx of immigration, you also get nativism. This led to what we call the Zoot Suit Riots. They're called the Zoot Suit Riots because the zoot suit was a style of dress that was favored by a lot of the Latino youths. It happened, broke out in Los Angeles between American sailors, Marines, and Latino youths. You have to go on a secret mission? Go ahead. Okay. And it led to a pretty awful riot in California. And again, it's a good example, a bad example of nativism. All right, when we talk about women, again, women did not serve in combat, but they did serve as nurses. They could serve as a WAC, a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, perform all kinds of different military duties that they would still be in danger. Again, they are not carrying a gun in their hands, but they are performing military functions that need to be done. At home, you could be a WOW, a Women's Ordnance Worker. And of course, who's the most famous WOW? You guessed it, Rosie. By the way, Rosie was a real woman. There was a song made called Rosie the Riveter. It was a propaganda tool to try to encourage women to join in the munitions factories. But the real Rosie worked in a factory in Michigan. That factory was falling apart, was rotting away, and a few years back, the United States government stepped in and realized, hey, this is kind of a national treasure. And now today it's a historic site. Let's talk about the big thing, though. It's on everybody's mind. It'll make you cry. Baseball.
Are you crying? Are you crying? There's no crying. There's no crying in baseball.
So many of our professional baseball players served their country. Why? Because it was the right thing to do. In fact, Major League Baseball kind of was frozen up, paused, until they got a green light from FDR, thumbs up, go ahead, to keep playing as a way to try to give people some sense of normalcy. Many major leaguers had their careers shortened in the 1940s, and it makes you wonder maybe what some of their statistics would be. Perhaps the greatest hitter in the history of baseball was Ted Williams. In 1941, he batted .406. He's the last guy to ever hit .400. Ted Williams served as a pilot during World War II. In fact, not only was he possibly the greatest hitter of all time, as much as it pains me to say this as a Yankees fan, he was also probably the greatest pilot of all time. Ted Williams had remarkable eyesight and racked up a really impressive service record. But because you had so many baseball players serving their country, to try to ensure there was enough baseball for everybody, women's professional baseball was created. Philip K. Wrigley, the guy who owned the Chicago Cubs, was one of the people who did this. And if you look at the homework assignment I gave you, one of the links was about Nancy Cato Mudge, or Nancy Mudge Cato. She was from Minola High School, and she's in our ESM Hall of Fame. And she played in that women's professional baseball league. If you watch the movie A League of Their Own, at the end they show women playing baseball. She's one of the women in there. All right, back to the big board. Talking about African Americans. Again, this is an awkward moment. You're saying you're fighting against racism and prejudice and discrimination, but we know this is still the time of Jim Crow in the South. This is an interesting symbol. For my in-laws, this is the 60s. This is peace, man. But if you go back to my grandpa's generation, this is V for victory. For African Americans during World War II, you put up the double V. V for victory against fascism abroad, but also V for victory in gaining equality. That shaking of the camera was my super soldier on a secret mission trying to get by. All right. During World War II, membership in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, sharply rose. Remember the NAACP, go back to the Progressive Era, started by W.E.B. Du Bois. The NAACP will be really important because they'll become the organization that will provide a lawyer for the Brown family in Brown versus Board of Education.
Someone's spying.
All right,
Someone's spying on us.
you go report. In 1941, we also have the Thundering March. Over 100,000 people led by A. Philip Randolph. Like a civil rights march 2.5 decades before that famous March on Washington that Dr. King led. A new civil rights organization was created, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. CORE will be another important civil rights organization. Now, African American civil rights leaders said they would lead another massive march on Washington, D.C. And they pushed FDR to do something about discrimination. And you do see a victory for the civil rights movement. Executive Order 8802, which effectively banned discrimination in the defense industries or in industries that were essential to the war effort. Does it solve problems? Does it end racism? No. Is it a step? Is it a victory? Yes. And again, when we talk about African American civil rights, don't forget about the Tuskegee Airmen. We referenced them earlier on. Okay, finishing up our World War II home front discussion, talking more about civil rights. Go back, reference John Adams with the Alien and Sedition Acts during the Quasi-War. Abe Lincoln was suspending habeas corpus against the Copperheads in the Civil War. The Espionage Act in the case of Schenck versus the U.S. during World War I. In 1942, Franklin Roosevelt, who rightfully deserves his reputation as one of the greatest presidents in American history, makes probably his worst decision as a president when he issues Executive Order 8802, which calls for the internment of Japanese Americans along the West Coast. There was a fear that Japan would invade the West Coast of the United States and that people of Japanese ancestry would be disloyal, or perhaps there were people who were there who were working or loyal to the enemy. So now imagine, you're a person who's been a law-abiding citizen. Maybe you're an immigrant, maybe you're the son, the grandson of immigrants. You're an American. And now all of a sudden you're being told you must report to what is essentially a nice way of saying a prison camp, with barbed wire, with men with guns who guard you. Then, compound that, there's no due process for you. We do have our Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which among other things has what's called the Due Process Clause, which says the government cannot take away your right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law. You're also guaranteed equal protection under the law based upon the 14th Amendment. Now you go to this camp, and the U.S. military would come, and they would try to recruit men to fight in the war effort, but not in the Pacific. In Europe only. In fact, one of the most decorated units we had in World War II in Europe was primarily of Japanese Americans. That's going to set up a Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. You got to know this one for the Regents, guys. 1944. The Supreme Court heard the case of Fred Korematsu, who refused to leave what was called a military restricted zone and report into an internment camp. And the Supreme Court ruled that the internment of Japanese Americans was a, quote, military necessity, and upheld the internment of Japanese Americans. This would stain us as a country, really, until 1988, when the United States government finally basically apologized for the internment of people, and the surviving members who had stayed in those camps were given reparations. You know, here's, I think it was $25,000. In the 1990s, Fred Korematsu was given a Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton. But again, it's always important to remember what happens to your civil rights during a time of war. Some miscellaneous stuff. Again, what happens to the power of the government? Look how the government gets heavily involved in the economy. They control time with daylight savings, war production. Franklin Roosevelt gets elected to not 3, but 4 terms during World War II. FDR will never finish that 4th term. In fact, he died 82 days into his 4th term, and then was replaced by Harry Truman. Other results. You got a lot of young men going off to serve our country. That led to a big delay in marriages. At the end of the war, you have millions of servicemen coming home who really miss their sweethearts. And, well, in the 1940s, right up into the early 1960s, America had what we now call the baby boom. In that time period, guys, we're talking 50 frickin' million new babies.
That's a bad word.
Or as that's a bad word. Say sorry. I'm sorry. Or as one stat I saw one time showed, in 1957, a new baby was born every 7 seconds. Think about that. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi. That's a lot of diapers. All right. World War II propaganda, talked about that. I gave you some links to play with. There's a couple others that you can check out. Bugs Bunny cartoons. When Warner Brothers had their 75th anniversary, they had this box set of DVDs. They had to yank it back off the shelves. No one did a lot of proofreading and editing. There were some really racist World War II propaganda cartoons that Warner Brothers put out. The Three Stooges. There are some hilarious Three Stooges shorts making fun of the Nazis, making fun of the Japanese, making fun of fascism. You know, Larry, Moe, and Curly by going, sweetly, that kind of stuff. They're able to win World War II. We talked about sports with the MLB. Give you one more. The Rose Bowl. Most famous college football game always played in Pasadena, California on New Year's Day. The 1942 Rose Bowl was actually played between the University of Oregon and Duke University. They had to play it in North Carolina because of the fear of attack. Okay? So, big ideas. Remember, war brings change. Talk about women, Japanese Americans, Native Americans. War changes politics. Smith versus Allwright, the Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court ruled that you cannot prohibit someone from joining a political party because of their race, simply so you can keep them from voting in primaries. War has economic changes. The 50s will see, after a little bit of readjustment in the late 40s, we'll see a massive economic boom. We'll see more consumerism. The power of the presidency. Again, FDR, 4 terms. The unfortunate power of the government in turning Japanese Americans. That concludes World War II, which means at least in the year 2020, we've hit the end of the road. We're done. And now we're going to transition. We'll do a little bit of Period 7 review, and then we're going to get you ready for this AP test. So until next time, remember, this is Mr. Eschbacher telling you, log off and plug in your chromies, homies.